Neil, well, I couldn't help this morning during the first panel to think of energy as being the elephant in the room. It was a sort of bookend around health, environment, migration. Some of what we're talking about here is going to shape those agendas for the future. Can't hear? Is going to shape those agendas for the future, and we should have been talking about energy then. But then in the second session, I thought, well, if you remember the last really bad crisis we had in 1975, it was another of these commodity ramps. And we went through a commodity ramp in 2006, 7, 8, and here we are again with the impacts of these runaway commodity prices. So we have to spend a bit more time thinking about them, what shapes them, and whether we can do something different. The market itself, well, I'll come to the market. Last year at the podium with Anil, I had a degree of optimism in my remarks. There was reason to think that the new U.S. government, the new Japanese government, might do something different in Copenhagen. It was on the horizon. Things were shaping up. There might have been some fairly limited expectations for Copenhagen, but we missed them by quite a while. We had some growth in our economies, so there was room for optimism, but it was deeply disappointing in the event. I think it's fair to say we have run up against the limits of multilateralism, and it really was only the Copenhagen Accord at the end of the day that was sort of put together by spontaneous minilateralism. A group of countries got together, decided they needed to have something to go home with and tell their electorate, and so we got the Copenhagen Accord. Not bad. It said some things, the 2 degrees, some commonality of political purpose, some commitments were submitted to the Copenhagen Accord afterwards, and if you tallied up those commitments, you could get yourself 50 or 60% of the way to our 2050 targets. The question then was, do you really believe these things are going to happen? Well, the ramp to Cancun is a bit rougher, I'm afraid. The preparatory sessions have not been good. The last session in Beijing was disappointing. President Obama has not gotten a congressional mandate. On the contrary, he never really got this piece of legislation before the Congress in any meaningful way. And if you look back at the Lugar presentation, it was more of a regulatory approach than it was a top-down sort of international commitment approach. The 17% reduction is still not in any kind of legislation, so President Obama is already out on a limb. And in the next elections, the midterm on the 2nd of November, if things go as poorly as the House, as some think they might, it's going to be a lot tougher in the last 2 years of the Obama administration, especially if the Senate is weakened, as would appear to be the case. A few more candidates like Christine O'Donnell, and maybe the Senate will go better, but for the time being, things are not looking all that good. In the meantime, the EU continues to debate in camera extending its 20% commitment to 30%. Why not? Happily, the Environment Council last week decided not to do that until they saw some comparability of effort around the circuit from other countries, so we won't confront that, at least in Cancun. And meanwhile, as you heard again this morning, the developing countries are sitting around waiting for the down payment on the income transfers, starting with the $30 billion and working their way to $100 billion. Okay. How soon are we going to, in today's economic environment and with the stresses on our economies, ante up $30 billion? I'm not optimistic that we'll see it by Cancun. In the meantime, IMF projections have got growth at 4.5% in 2010, quite impressive. We heard this morning China 9.6, India 8.5, the EU 1.7. Well, but that growth is very impressive, and so we are on our track. We're on the track for our worst case scenario for emissions. Maybe Rio plus 20 offers some opportunity, but look at 2012 and the numbers of elections in 2012. Do you think there'll really be any serious mandates available for Rio plus 2? So we're looking for the right combination of participants. Is it going to be the G20? Is it going to be the major economies forum? What kind of mini-lateralism can possibly come together? You don't need many countries to get 60 or 80% of emissions. So you don't really need a large consensus. And that consensus could say, well, guys, these are the rules of the game. Here's how it's going to happen over the next years. Could happen, and hasn't yet. In the meantime, since we can't get the top down, it's time for us to focus a lot more on the bottom up. And we heard some pretty good bottom up stuff earlier today. We need databases, we need to be able to benchmark, we got to be able to measure, we got to be able to verify. We have to do things at sub-federal levels, municipal levels, state levels, carbon trading, the ETS, all of these things. The potential for sectoral agreements, why not? There's been a lot of work done in sectoral agreements in cement, in other places, chemicals, fertilizers, glass, aluminum. Everybody's using the same technologies. Everybody's competing in the same markets largely. There may be some resistance in some sectors, but this concern about carbon leakage as a function of carbon prices has not been demonstrated. We don't see delocalizations because of that. There are other reasons, but not because of carbon prices. So I think we need to be a little bit more aggressive in setting up some of these mechanisms. If you had an ETS, carbon trading in Chicago, carbon trading in some states, Japan is working on a carbon trading system, and you found ways to link these things, you could begin building a common global approach to carbon and maybe some sense for what carbon prices could be over time. So there's a lot that could be done. In energy markets, GDP is increasing. You want me to finish? No. I hope not. Got a lot more to say here. In energy markets, GDP is increasing. Growth is picking up outside the OECD, obviously. Energy consumption is growing accordingly. Unfortunately, I think greenhouse gases are growing faster because of the heavier carbon content and the lower efficiency of some of the economies that are growing the fastest. Inside the OECD, the newly discovered phenomenon of shale gas is providing a bridge to the future, but it's a carbon bridge to the future. And so we need to be careful not to say to ourselves, look at here, we can shut down our coal plants, we'll put in gas plants, we're kind of halfway there. That's not going to work. We need to bear in mind it's the carbon content, and you don't get that much of a savings out of gas, 50%, that's a lot, but it's not enough. We've been reminded that energy disasters can be an incentive to lower carbon energies over the last days. Somali pirates, hurricanes, oil spills in the Gulf, pipeline getting blown up in Nigeria. There are lots of things that should incentivize us to look for lower carbon options. And there are some good signs. OECD energy efficiency is on the improving side again. Global effort to field electric vehicles is going to take some time, but it's underway. Greater investments in low carbon energies, some through stimulus packages, some through subsidy programs, and some just because people realize that we need to move in that direction. These are the bottom-up strategies that are quite useful. The paths to the future are known. We know that you can get a good bit out of CCS if it's deployed fast enough, maybe 19% of reductions from CCS, renewables another 20%, nuclear 5 to 10%, depends. Fuel switching 15%, efficiency 45%. Who's working on efficiency? Everybody talks about it, but you don't really see any action. It's the cheapest, it's cost negative, and yet efficiency is the least pursued, at least politically. Technically, I believe we could get world emissions down to 14.5 gigatons by 2050, but we are not on our way for the time being. Emissions have been rising globally. 1990 to 2000 emissions rose about 1.1%. In the 7 years afterwards, they rose 3%, and that in large measure because of coal. We're sort of reaching a point where our forecasts, our BP, IEA, and other forecasts saying that we can do this through mitigation are no longer the case. Can you really expect to do this through mitigation? And yet, isn't there a risk that if you start shifting attention to adaptation, politicians say, oh, the hard decisions in adaptation are 50 years down the road. That's much better than having to deal with mitigation today. So let's talk about adaptation and we stop mitigating. That would be a bad scenario. Haven't talked a lot about it. Ban Ki-moon did this morning, energy poverty. Last month's MDG meeting got some information from a group of associations, the IEA, UNIDO, and UNDP. There is no Millennium Development Goal for energy. Plans to reduce poverty, extreme poverty by 2015 are essentially meaningless if you don't deal with energy poverty. So it's in there. In fact, really none of the Millennium Goals are feasible if you don't deal with energy policy. Some of the numbers, 1.4 billion people lacking access to electricity, 40% of them in Africa, 30% in India, 27% in other Asia, 2.7 billion people relying on traditional biomass for cooking and lighting, and more women and children die prematurely of biomass pollution than die of malaria, tuberculosis, or HIV/AIDS, about 1.5 million a year. Actually, about 15 since I started talking. Only 31% of sub-Saharan Africans have access to electricity, and New Yorkers consume the same amount of terawatt hours as the 791 million Africans. So UNIDO and UNDP IEA have developed what they call a Universal Modern Energy Access Case. It provides for accelerated access to clean cooking facilities and electricity. The goals are ambitious, but it has established a policy target. The cost of the greater access to electricity by 2030 is $700 billion, or about $33 billion a year. The cost of cleaner cooking would be $56 billion, or about $2.6 billion a year. That's $1 per beneficiary per year. Pretty low cost improvement in life. And I should think that we could find some of our monies in our development assistance to get into those kinds of areas. They are really cost-effective ways to change the lives of a lot of folks out there. But there's another way, and that's subsidies. Take another look at subsidies. They distort energy prices around the world and markets. There's some very valid reasons for subsidies, so you can't just toss them out. You need to have them for some various reasons, but they could be done more efficiently. About 252 billion of the world's 312 billion annual subsidies are in developing countries, 252 billion. That 252 billion is 7 times larger than the investment needed per year to provide the accelerated access discussed above. Redirecting inefficient subsidies to providing access would be pretty sound policy. It can be done. We can get CO2 down. We can get poverty down. The tools are there. Unfortunately, the political will is not there. And as soon as the political will is there, we've got to get the instructions out to the private sector, because all of the official money in the world is not going to do this job. It's going to require the private sector. And if they don't have the instructions, the guidance, the stability of investment environment, cost of carbon, and some other basic essentials, they can't do it.